All right, well, anyway, it's a pleasure to have Andrew Eckford here. Welcome to another installation of the Biomathematics Research Forum, also known as the Mathematical Life Sciences Seminar. Andrew is a professor in the Department of Computer Science at York University, just a stone's throw north of here. I think if you get on a speedboat and you just go straight across Lake Erie, and you'll end up in his backyard. He's been working on aspects of information theory applied to signaling in very small spaces. You can think of if you wanted to design nanoscale materials and have tiny little components talking to each other, you would run into novel kinds of communication problems. And it turns out that very similar kinds of problems arise in looking at the way cells communicate with each other, or the pieces of a cell communicate with them inside a cell by diffusion. And so we're very happy to have him here today to talk about some topics in molecular communication that may have applications both on the nano engineering side and also possibly in mathematical biology.
Good. Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Case for the invitation. I've never been to Cleveland before. In fact, I've never been to Ohio before, so thank you for helping me fulfill one of my life's goals to visit all 50 states. I think I'm up to 16 now.
Big Hawaii.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, let's have a meeting in Hawaii. So this topic of molecular communication, it's particularly nice to be here speaking about it to a research group that's actually interested in it. So when I was first looking at this problem, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, I thought I was the only person in the world crazy enough to have thought of this idea and be pursuing it. In fact, at the time it wasn't true, and now it's even less true. So there seemed to be an emerging body of research looking at ways in which to apply the mathematical machinery of information theory and communications theory to the way in which cells talk to each other. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to review a little bit about the mathematical theory of this communication, the machinery of information theory that we adapt to it, and I'm going to spend some considerable time talking about my own work in this field. So, really, when I began looking at this, I was motivated by the question of how do tiny devices communicate? Well, what do we mean by tiny? So, everybody knows what that is. That's pretty small, but it's not anything special necessarily by today's technology. This is something a little smaller. This is actually a device I use in a different kind of project. It's called an iMote. It's about yay big, and it's got a microprocessor, a radio, and a suite of sensors all packed into that little tiny board. So there's a quarter there, but it's about this big. And literally, it's about the same size as the batteries that are attached to it, which is 3 AAAs. This is even smaller. This is a famous image that you might see in sensor networking talks. These are what people used to talk about when they talked about smart dust. So this is a tiny little device with a radio on it. Again, a small microprocessor, and it's got at least one sensor. I think it's got a temperature sensor on there. But what you can see from this is that this was state of the art in 2001. So 10 years ago. 10 years ago, this was the state of the art in engineering tiny devices for communication. So the idea with these was you just throw a bunch of them into a room, they float around probably, they might not even sink to the ground necessarily if there were breezes, and they would take measurements and transmit them back to some central agency. So that's pretty tiny, but
why U.S. coinage?
It was this isn't our result. I just stole the image, but it was I can't remember what group made these, but it was an American group for sure. So one theme that you'll notice on the last slide is that all of the ways in which to communicate have been restricted to electromagnetic communication. So in other words, all of the devices that I just showed you are wireless in the sense of electromagnetic waves. On the other hand, basically every time that any of us communicates in this room using digital technologies, we're using something like either a wire for Ethernet. If you think about how the signal propagates on the backbone, that's an optical fiber. Again, wireless, probably all of us in this room have a cell phone. But fundamentally, these are all based on electromagnetism. And this is the perspective from which all communications engineers have been trained basically up to the present day. Communications and information theory started out as disciplines of computer science and electrical engineering for exactly this reason, that basically all of the engineered communication that we deal with at present has to do with electromagnetism. So the question that I'm motivated by is this: are these appropriate strategies for nanoscale devices? So there's, the answer is not necessarily no. There are ways in which to manufacture nanoscale radios, nanoscale components, but it is remarkably difficult. There does also seem to be a computational and a power penalty from using electromagnetic radiation that might not be desirable for a nanoscale device. And furthermore, if you think about the possible applications of this, in particular, the medical applications and the those sorts of things that you might want to do with this, the environment is rather harsh to electromagnetism. So, for instance, the body is saline, and saline doesn't really propagate electromagnetic waves very well. Is there a question?
Is it, they say, electromagnetic waves inappropriate because wavelengths is much larger than ours?
That's also an excellent point. So usually, radio communications is most efficient when the components are are proportional to the wavelength. So, for instance, antennas to be most efficient should be a quarter or a half wavelength. So, in order, if you have a nanoscale system, if those components are at a quarter or a half wavelength, you're talking with frequencies up into the infrared. So that's not appropriate. Necessarily. Now there are some recent. The reason why I don't completely rule that out is that there are some recent works showing that it is possible to design reasonably efficient nanoscale radios. But again, you're usually incurring a power penalty, you're incurring computational penalties, and so on, and these are not necessarily appropriate.
What's the penalty for infrared?
Heat absorption, right?
Heat absorption, that's right. Infrared does not propagate through the atmosphere very well.
So you have some really strong absorption bands in aqueous systems.
That's correct, yeah. So water really likes to absorb infrared. But what I'm sort of thinking of is like electronic components. So these do scale down, but ultimately they do incur penalties. And if your application is not necessarily suited to that, then perhaps that's something you don't want to pay. But in particular, part of what this project is motivated by is the idea that nature has solved this problem. There exist nanoscale devices in nature, and these communicate somehow. These are what the devices look like. So these don't have electronic components. They consume very little power. They've had billions and billions of years to get very efficient at what they do. And the solution to the communication problem that these devices have come up with is exchanging chemical messengers. So this is really why we look at molecular communication. It's because if you want to scale down to the nanoscale, firstly, it's not obvious that electromagnetic communication is the best solution. It is a solution, but it's possibly not the best solution. But down at this scale, there do exist alternatives, and those alternatives have to do with exchanging molecules. So, bacteria and other cells communicate by exchanging chemical messengers over a fluid medium. So the classic example that people often think about is quorum sensing. So in quorum sensing, what an organism will do is it will basically broadcast a message that says, "Here I am." and its neighbors will receive these messages, and based on the concentration of the surrounding "here I am" messages, they will conclude that the local population of their species is something.
But bacteria is about 100 nanometers, right?
Pardon me?
Bacteria size.
Yes, that's right. So okay, so I can. The scale of a bacteria can be anything from about a micron to about 100 nanometers. There's a fairly wide variation. Now, I can sort of say this. I talk about nanoscale communication. Basically, I'm not being strict sense in terms of nanotechnology here. I'm not restricting myself to 100 nanometers. So, in fact, I'm involved in a standardization effort to say what exactly do we mean when we talk about nanoscale communication. But I'm basically using nanoscale as an abbreviation for very small. So I'm not necessarily restricting myself to any dimensions. So the issue about quorum sensing and other forms of chemical communication is that they're very poorly understood from an information theoretic perspective. They are extremely well understood and widely studied, although there do obviously exist many interesting open problems. They're very well studied from a biological perspective. So the biological literature has spent an awful lot of effort trying to understand what these cells are saying to each other and exactly the mechanisms by which they do that. Information theory, on the other hand, is concerned with the following question. What is the maximum rate at which reliable communication can occur, and how do you achieve that? So this is a problem that has essentially not been studied in the literature up till about 5 years ago, which is surprising given the huge volume of work from biology. But I suggest it's because information theorists are generally electrical engineers and know very little about biology, so there's been very little crossover in those two communities until recently. So in order to define what we're talking about, I'd like to present a model for communications. So this, if you've ever taken a course on information theory, this is what they always put up as basically the first diagram. This is how we define communications mathematically. So we're concerned with digital communications. In other words, we have a discrete set of messages. These messages are abstract. They can mean essentially anything, but they're enumerated from some discrete set. So the idea is I select one of the messages from this set, I pass it to a device which I call a transmitter, which translates that message from the discrete set into something that can be conveyed across a shared medium. So that message is transmitted across the medium in some way. The receiver detects the output of the channel and translates that back into a guess of what message was sent. And then hopefully the message that I guessed, M prime, is equal to the message that I sent, M. If that is true, then reliable communication has occurred. Now, I've said nothing about the mechanism of the transmitter, the mechanism of the receiver, or the nature of the medium. And so therefore, this communications model is completely abstract and can be applied to any scenario in which communication occurs. What makes this problem non-trivial is that there's generally distortion in the medium. So if there were no distortion in the medium, then the problem would, there would be really nothing to solve here. But the field of information theory is basically all about, given that this message is distorted on its path from transmitter to receiver, what is the maximum number of messages that I can transmit within a certain period of time, and ensure that it is still reliable. In other words, I have arbitrarily high probability that the guess will be equal to the originally transmitted message. So the question